On behalf of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society and the Institute of Jewish Studies, University College London, I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture. It's very nice to have someone who's local as an expert on the topic, this evening's topic. This is our own David Jacobson. I think he's well known to everybody here, but he's really had two careers, one in material science and engineering with the topic of his PhD, after which he taught at Ben Gurion University and then came back to London and had a very successful career in industry at Johnson Matthey Metals and then at Marconi and then finally in Buckinghamshire University. But side by side with his interests in technology and metals, he has very long career of interest in the archaeology of ancient Israel, with a long association with the Palestine Exploration Fund and also with the Institute of Jewish Studies at University College and the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. And one of his key interests is in coinage, perhaps because of his combining his interest in metals and archaeology, and we end up with coins as a logical combination. But it's very nice to have a local expert to be able to call upon, who's someone who has an international reputation and as an expert in this field. And we're very pleased to hear his latest thinking and his latest work on the beginnings of Judean coinage, which is an extremely important topic, both historically and culturally and from the point of artistically and iconography. Okay, David, you have the floor. Over to you.
Well, I first want to thank, before I forget, to thank the two sponsoring organizations, the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society and the Institute for Jewish Studies. Now, I particularly wish to thank Mark Geller, the director of the Institute for Classical Studies, for his very effusive introduction. It's a great honor that he introduced me. I've known Mark quite a long time, but I was quite impressed to learn that this year he's celebrating his 40th anniversary as director of the Institute for Jewish Studies. I think that is a remarkable achievement. And I think that it's a great, a great feather in his cap. Anyway, I will begin my lecture now. And the subject, as you will know from the post, is the beginnings of Judean coinage. There were two beginnings. What you see in front of you on this first slide is an image of one of the earlier coins. It's silver. It's tiny, it's minuscule. It's a few millimeters in diameter and weighs a fraction of a gram. It's typical of what I call the first run of Judean coinage. And it's quite typical of the coins that appear in the Levant in the late Persian period. As I said, it's silver. The iconography, the images that you see on this coin, of course, it's greatly magnified on the slide. On the obverse, the front side, you have a stylized lily, and on the reverse, you have a bird. And you have an inscription, and that is what is of particular interest, because the motifs are fairly common, although the lily is a bit unusual on coins of this period, although it's very common in other media, on ivory and on metalwork and so on, of the region. But the inscription tells us that it is Yehud, that is where these coins were minted. Yehud, as we all know, is ancient Judah. Judah as reconstituted after the return from Babylon under Persian aegis to the former Judah, now known as Yehud in Aramaic. It is a tiny state. Its dimensions, just to bring home that point, of from west to east, from the foothills of the Judean hills to the River Jordan, about 60 kilometers. And from north to south, from Bethel down to Beth Sur, Hebron actually was at that time in Idumea. It wasn't part of Judea. It was part of another sub-province. So the total area is no greater than 1.5 times that of Greater London. And yet, as we all know, Judea, the Jews, punched their weight, punched well above their weight in historical terms. And my talk is going to be about the coins of this tiny state and what they tell us about the culture and politics of the early Second Temple period. Right, now, the first coins of Yehud were minted they start to appear around about 400 BCE. So, and they continue past the transition to the Hellenistic period, Alexander the Great, and end in the first part of the Ptolemaic period in the reign of Ptolemy II or Ptolemy III, so let's say round about 250 BC. The earliest phase, pre-Alexander the Great, the scene, the political scene, was dominated by two powerful Persian governors. I'm simplifying now, I have to, because the subject that's covered by this lecture is absolutely encyclopedic. So I have to simplify and narrow down, and so please accept that as a compromise that I've had to make. Anyway, the two powerful characters in the late Persian Empire were the two governors. One was Pharnabazus and the other was Mazaeus. Pharnabazus, or Pharnabazu in Persian, was the major figure in the first third of the 4th century BCE. He was the governor or satrap of what is known to us today as Hellespontine Phrygia. What that means is the area south of the Sea of Marmara on the northwest corner of what is Asia Minor or Turkey of today. But he operated well outside that area. He was active on behalf of the Persian monarchy in Greece and against Egypt, and I'll come back to that. We can piece together his career from material remains, but also from Greek texts, from Greek historians, particularly Thucydides and Xenophon. During the early 4th century, after the Peloponnesian War, Sparta was the ascendant power in Greece, and he spent quite a lot of his early career as a senior diplomat and general, combating the aspirations of Sparta. And in fact, he sided for much of the period with Athens. We then find him having to being charged with an expedition against Egypt. Egypt broke free of Persian rule in the early 4th century. And so he led 2 expeditions against Egypt, both of which were failures. And then he fades out. The next character who comes along is Mazaeus, or Mazdai, who was the governor of Cilicia, and he, as it were, holds the stage in the second third of the 4th century BCE. And he played a very prominent role in the trying to counter the Alexander the Great's expeditions against Persia. He led the Persian cavalry at the fateful battle of Gaugamela, which resulted in the extinction of the Persian Empire. But he was a very wily character. He defected to Alexander. Alexander obviously looked at his CV and realized that he was a very competent administrator and allowed him to remain as governor of Babylonia. So a remarkable person. Anyway, now coming to the coins. The top central coin, you can see my cursor, is a coin from Samaria, the neighbor of Judah. And it shows a portrait of Pharnabazus with an inscription. You can see the inscription better in the drawing here. It's not quite the same coin, but it's the same type of coin. It says Pharnabazus. And on the reverse is a winged Pegasus type, with Shomron, Samaria, written back to front. A better portrait of Pharnabazus is on a coin from Cyzicus. Cyzicus is on the southern shore of the Sea of Marmara. It was a Greek city, and they had the high-quality Greek artists at work there. And you have this absolutely beautiful coin portrait of him with his characteristic leather cap of Persian governors. So you see him influencing the coins of Samaria, which is quite far down to the south. And it's believed that this particular issue coincided with one of his expeditions against Egypt when Pharnabazus moved south. As far as Mazaeus is concerned, he's everywhere. He was a very powerful governor, and he had dealings with Sidon. Sidon was in Phoenicia, on the Phoenician coast. The Phoenicians had a stellar reputation as sailors and as navigators, and their fleet, their battle fleet, was incorporated into the Persian navy and actually represented the bulk of the Persian navy in the Mediterranean. So they were proud to advertise this fleet on their coins. The obverse of this coin shows a Phoenician war galley. The reverse has an image of the Persian king in a chariot with the local king of Sidon behind with his staff of office, which looks a bit like a hockey stick here. As you know, the Persians devolved their administration and they allowed local kings to rule their small domains. Then we turn further south to Samaria, and we see the war galley again. It's a very similar image, but now with the inscriptions Shomron, Samaria. On the reverse is an image of the Persian king fighting with a lion, and the abbreviated form of Mazaeus's name, the Mem and the Zion, Mem Z, for Mazaeus or Mazdai. The main mint in the Levant of this period, covering these two large important satraps, was Tarsus. Tarsus is situated at the actual corner between the northeast corner of the Mediterranean between Turkey and Syria. And so it was on an important crossroads. In fact, the Battle of Issus, which was fought between Alexander and King Darius III, was close to Tarsus. And here is the principal coin of Pharnabazus minted in Tarsus, and it shows a frontal face who happens to be Arethusa, the water nymph of Syracuse. And Syracuse is in Sicily, so I need to explain what she's doing on a coin of Pharnabazus and Tarsus, and I will do so shortly. On the reverse is a crested, helmeted warrior with a beard. And the inscription is very interesting. It's in Aramaic. And it says Pharnabazu Chilik, which means Pharnabazus of Cilicia. Okay. Matthias, who was actually the satrap of Cilicia, issued his own coins. And the stata of Matthias shows the Baal of Tarsus, the chief god of Tarsus, with the inscription Baal Tars on the obverse. And it's a very, very interesting image because Alexander the Great copied this image for Zeus on his coins. Anyway, he's shown seated on his throne, holding his staff of office in one arm, and on his outstretched hand is a twig, a branch, holding a bunch of grapes and an ear of wheat or of grain. It could be barley, grain. And he also has his emblematic animal. Now, being the chief god, of course, it has to be an important animal, so it's an eagle. Now, what fascinated me, was the grapes and the grain, because it rang bells. It's part of the Jewish Sabbath ritual is a blessing on the wine and the bread. And this is where it comes from. These were the staples considered to be the principal staples of everyday life in the Near East. Of course, later this blessing over the wine and the bread was adopted by Christians with a different meaning, and it became the Eucharist. So we're beginning to see cultural influences at work here, which is, to me, what makes this subject of coin iconography absolutely fascinating. The other side of this coin shows a lion triumphing over a bull. It is a variant of the one we saw earlier, the Persian king fighting against a lion. And anyway, the inscription on this coin is Mazdai, Matthias. Coming back to the Arethusa, let me show you where this image comes from. It comes from the large silver pieces of Syracuse, which produced the most beautiful coins, still recognized as the most beautiful coins of Greek art from the high period of Greek art in antiquity, where Arethusa is surrounded by dolphins, has this marvelous hairstyle of flowing locks, and wears a collar or a necklace. And these aspects of this portrait are reinterpreted on the coin of Pharnabazus. So, good art has always been appreciated. We're going to see these images reappear, reinterpreted on the coins of Yehud. And that makes it very interesting indeed, and relevant, and explains why I'm showing you these coins here. However, when we look at the coinage of the beginning of the 4th century BCE, the picture is dominated by the coins of Attica, the famous owl coins of Athens, which feature Athens' patron goddess, Athena, shown in profile with a crested helmet on the obverse, and her emblematic animal, which is an owl, with a sprig of olives, and the three first letters of her name with alpha, theta, and epsilon. And these coins circulated everywhere. Athens, the reason for this was, of course, Athens was the predominant economic power in the 5th century BCE. And of course, that influence continued. Athens also, or Attica, the province of Athens, was a major source of silver. And it also helps to explain Athens' wealth and the presence of Athenian silver around the Mediterranean. I've mentioned the mints of Tarsus, Sidon, and Samaria. Of course, I'm going to now talk about the mints of Jerusalem and Philistia. The vessel you see at the top is here. Put this in because it again shows the cultural fusions that was in progress in this period. This is actually an earlier example. It's an amphoriscus from the Levant. So these cultural interactions were already very much taking place for a long period, even before. But it's a marvelous example where we have, as it were, Levantine technology glass, where Phoenicia and Egypt were preeminent, and the aesthetic of design of the Greek amphora. I thought that encapsulates beautifully what was happening. Anyway, coming back to the owl coins of Athens, imitations were everywhere. Here we have an imitation from Cilicia, where you have a helmeted male figure now, bearded, with a crested helmet, and the owl, the Athenian owl with the olives, but they're now 2 leaves, in the form of 2 leaves. This informs me, this particular coin made the penny drop. I was always wondering where that bearded male with a helmeted male that we saw on the coin of Tarsus, where that came from. I believe it's a morphed version of the Athena image on the Athens coin, in fact. But the Cilicians preferred it to be a male, so they changed the sex. Here we have the owl of Athens in a Sumerian interpretation, where you see the first 2 letters of the goddess's name, but the Hebrew name, Hananiah, written below. Below the Cilician coin, we have a version, an interpretation from Philistia, where the god is, the deity can either be male or female from what I can see, but more importantly, there is a little Aramaic mem here, which stands for Manus, the chief deity of Gaza. The Yehud variety of the owl, these are all minuscule versions, by the way. You can see they're all only 9 millimeters, 10 millimeters, etc. They're tiny things. It has the Yehud inscription in Paleo-Hebrew and what does look more like Athena. So very influential, and many of the early Yehud coins are versions of the Athenian owl. But the very first coins are larger coins. They are of drachma denomination, and they are each of them unique. We only have one example of each of these 2. And they have their own fascination for scholars. On the obverse of this coin, which was only found a few decades ago, it only turned up a few decades ago, has the frontal female head with a collar or a necklace. So it's obviously the Arethusa type, but morphed into an Egyptian-style goddess. This is a Hathor-type headdress. And on the reverse is what we saw in the Mosaic coin from Tarsus, a lion triumphing over a bull, but Yehud written in Aramaic. No, this is not Paleo-Hebrew, this is an Aramaic. And the other main coin, the helmeted warrior with a beard and crested helmet, but the reverse. And this really was quite scandalous when it came to the attention of scholars, when this coin, which as I said is there's a unique example, and it's in the British Museum, and it was first published at the beginning of the 19th century. Why was it scandalous? Because it shows a deity on a winged chariot holding his emblematic animal, which to me looks like a falcon, not like an eagle, facing a bearded head, balded head, very enigmatic piece, this. And of course, scholars were worried because they thought, what is this? Is this the God of Israel represented on a coin of Judah? Yehud. That's what the inscriptions tell us. Anyhow, these coins continue, mostly smaller denominations, right until the reign of either Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III, when they come to an end, probably when, as a result of the Ptolemaic administration deciding to centralize, and they shut down a lot of provincial mints. But the coin, I'm showing it here, an example of one of the later Yehud coins in this silver series, because it's based on a Ptolemaic coin design. It shows the eagle on a thunderbolt, the emblematic animal, bird of Zeus, with a shaven head based on the head of Ptolemy, which you find on the Egyptian, on the Ptolemaic coins. Now, it may amaze you that what you're hearing is all new to you. I'm not surprised, because the very first monograph on the coins of Yehud was only published this year. In fact, it's a new subject. And as I said, it's because these coins are tiny. They literally slip through the hands of archaeologists and historians. Of course, they've been known to scholars for some time. The very first one has been known for 200 years or so. But as a subject, as a developed subject, it's all very new. Now, I can strongly recommend the volume, which is called The Coinage of Yehud, or the Yehud Coinage, I think that's the right way around, by Chaim Gittler and his co-authors. It's absolutely fascinating. And one of the topics that he looks at, which really caught my attention, was the depiction of religious subjects on these coins. And that is an aspect that I do want to bring to your attention, because it is absolutely fascinating. There are 4 coins in a series, all with a falcon on the reverse, all inscribed Yehud, of course. Now, by the way, after those 2 large drachma coins were minted, probably in Gaza, they were evidently meant for a client in Judah, because of the Yehud. Maybe they never circulated, and that might help to explain why they contain these polytheistic subjects on them. But anyway, the mint then moved to Jerusalem, or near Jerusalem. The scholars, the authors of this volume that I mentioned, suggest that maybe the mint was at Ramat Rachel outside Jerusalem. But it doesn't matter. It was in the vicinity of Jerusalem. The four images of religious nature, the first one is that lily that I showed on the first slide, but then we have a shofar, a ram's horn, an ear, and a bird which looks like a dove. This is one of the best preserved examples I could find. So it's sort of surmised that it's a dove. We know, obviously, of connections with Judaism of these four images. The lily appears as a decoration on the high priest's garment and on the pillars in front of the sanctuary of the Solomonic temple. The ram's horn is blown on the new year. It's mentioned in the Bible. As for the ear, there are lots of expressions in the Bible about God listening or God hearing. And the dove, well, we know that in the Second Temple period, for sure, doves were a common sacrificial offering. And we have, as an example of this most fascinating artifact from the excavations next to the Temple Mount, of a handle of a jar, of a stone vessel. Stone vessels, we now know, were specific in that period to Jewish practice. And it's inscribed Kurban, and there are scratched images of two doves underneath. So doves were sacrificed in Jerusalem. On the other hand, in nearby Ashkelon, they were nothing of the kind. They were the dove was the emblematic animal of Aphrodite or Astarte, their patron goddess. And Philo, the Jewish philosopher of the 1st century CE, on his way to Jerusalem, where he went on pilgrimage, passed through Ashkelon and saw flocks of doves. Of course, you could not touch them because they were sacred to the goddess. So there's an ambiguity about this dove reference. But there's an ambiguity with all these four images that have a religious connection. The ram's horn, how do we know that polytheistic cults in the area, in the region, also didn't use ram's horns as part of their rituals? As for the ear, well, that's part of the human anatomy. It contravenes the prescription of graven images. So it's not possible to be too definite about any of this, except to say that all these coins of Yehud in this early phase, every one of them has either a human or animal or both represented on them. Even these two. This one has they both have interesting inscriptions. This one mentions Hezekiah, Yezkiah, Hapecha, Hezekiah the governor, and this second one, Yochaniah HaKohen, John the priest. As you can see, the obverse has the Arethusa type. This is a small coin from Tarsus, our point of reference, which has a very similar Arethusa type on it. Sorry, I need to go back again. The owl, of course, is the owl of Athens, the owl coins. I don't know why I'm being pushed forward. Maybe it's being hinted that I'm going too slowly. I don't know. Anyway, so there's this enigma of the fact that these are all iconic coins. I mentioned that this run of coins ends in the Ptolemaic period. Then for over 100 years, there's nothing. No coins from Judea or Judah, nothing at all. And then suddenly they appear, but they're different next time round. We're talking about a period immediately after the end of the Maccabean revolt, although the Jews are still fighting for their independence. And indeed, the very first issue was produced by John Hyrcanus, who was then still subservient to the Seleucid king, Antiochus VII Euergetes, Sidetes. It's dated. From now on, the coins are all in bronze, not in silver anymore. They all are aniconic, no human or animal images. So they are different in character. And that's why I talk about the beginnings, because this is a second beginning. It's totally divorced from the first run of coins, apart from the fact that, as you will see, the inscriptions are in Paleo-Hebrew script and in Hebrew language. That is the only common characteristic linking the two runs of coins. But anyway, let's look at the images. The first one, this first issue, dated fortunately, so we know that this particular one, which has an alpha at the front, is from 132, 131 BCE. There's another companion one with a beta, and I'll show you that on the next slide. So they're dated. The obverse has a lily. It's a more naturalistic lily than the stylized one we saw on the first coin that I showed you, or the earlier silver coin. It's Hellenic in its artistic form. And on the reverse is an inverted anchor. Now, the inverted anchor was the emblem of the Seleucid dynasty. I could give you a lecture on the origin of the anchor as a Seleucid symbol, but I won't. It's enough to mention that for our purposes today, that it is a Seleucid royal symbol. In fact, it occurs on Seleucid coins right from the beginning, from the reign of Seleucus I Nicator. On this coin, which shows Athena, Promachos, Athena, the warrior goddess, standing over an inverted anchor. More contemporary to our Jerusalem issue is the silver drachma of Demetrius II Nicator, which is closer in date. All these anchors are of the same form. They all have a crosspiece. They all have a loop connected to their tops. And of course, this is actually a Seleucid coin. It appears it's in catalogs of Seleucid coins. However, what I do want to say, although these the coins that I'm going to show you, the Hasmonaean coins, all in bronze, are aniconic, there were aniconic Seleucid coins, even of the same period. So they're not unique in being aniconic. This is just a caveat, because it's always easy to generalize. We've got to be careful about this. Here is a coin of Antiochus Sidetes, the same Antiochus mentioned on the Judean coin, showing a prow of a ship and a trident. No human or animal represented on this coin. And you find that from time to time on the smaller Seleucid coins. Now, what happens is Antiochus VII goes off to try to put down a rebellion by the Parthians in the east of the Seleucid Empire and loses his life. As a result, John Hyrcanus is able to break totally free from Seleucid rule and issues coins in his own name. And the first Hasmonean issue is, in a way, the most beautiful and the best of all of them. There are 3 denominations. They all have similar inscriptions. It's either John, the high priest, Yochanan HaKohen HaGadol. He's either Rosh HaChever HaYehudim, the head of the Council of the Jews, or it's just, and more usually, as John the high priest and the Council of the Jews. So the ruling authority is a diarchy. There are 2 sources of power. The high priest and his ruling council, which was probably later it's the predecessor of the Sanhedrin. As I said, there are three denominations, and I'm now going to describe to you the motifs and show you their origins. By the way, I have the inscriptions, of course, all in Paleo-Hebrew, which may be more difficult for some of you to read. So I've transcribed it into square Hebrew for your benefit. There's an A on this particular middle denomination, which is rather interesting. The largest coin shows a pair of twinned cornucopias. Now that emblem, that symbol, first appears during the reign of Ptolemy II. It's mentioned in Greek literature of the period, and it also appears on the coins of Ptolemy II, specifically in connection with the death of his sister and wife Hasmonaean II, Philadelphus, who was virtually co-ruler with him. And therefore, the emblem represents the bounty of prosperity, the prosperity brought by the royal pair, by the royal couple. That's its meaning. The royal aspect is emphasized by the presence of this fillet, this ribbon tied to the cornucopias. Why? Because the Hellenistic kings mostly didn't wear metal crowns. They wore a ribbon band tied behind the head as a sign of their royal authority. So this fillet, which you will often find, and I'll show you other contexts where it appears, is to do, it relates to the ruler, the ruling authority. By the way, this gold piece of Ptolemy II, although it's a normative Ptolemaic piece, this one was minted in Jaffa, Joppa. The one below, which is more similar to our Hasmonaean piece, has a wavy fillet, like the one below. They're similar. Also, the way the fruit is shown is very similar in the two cases. This was minted in Akko by Cleopatra Cleopatra Thea. Cleopatra Thea was the consort of 3 Seleucid kings and the mother of several Seleucid kings as well. And this was minted when she, in a very short period, when she was based in Akko and ruled all on her own. Her son later joined her, and he seemed to have got tired of her at some point and had her poisoned. But that's another story. The point is that where we find these twinned cornucopias on Seleucid coins is because of the Ptolemaic connection. She was the daughter of Ptolemy VI, and hence the link between these motifs are shown on Ptolemaic and Seleucid coins, because she was at the point when Cleopatra Thea, minted this coin, she was a Seleucid queen. Right. The helmet on its own, the prototype is a coin of Macedonia, minted by Philip V, in the name of Alexander the Great. These little coins, although Macedonia is quite far from Judea, a few of these coins have turned up in Judea and might have provided the model for the Seleucid coin. Seleucid king of the, Hasmonaean coin. The Seleucid kings often wore crested helmets of this type, which are called Boeotian helmets. Here you have Alexander Belus wearing such a helmet over his diadem, his fillet diadem, and you can see the ends of the fillet waving. behind his head there. Turning to the next motif, we have splayed cornucopias and a fruit pod of some sort. Many Israeli and other numismatists believe this to be a pomegranate. I'll explain to you in a moment why I think it's something else. And you see the fruit issuing from the horns of plenty, but prominent among them are 2 ears of corn, and that is significant, as you will see. The prototype of this is not too clear in the sense that there's no exact prototype, but there are similar configurations. This is one from Levant in Ionia from the mid-2nd century BCE, where you have an owl, not a fruit, but an owl between two splayed cornucopias, and below a coin from Ephesus in Ionia with a branch between 2 cornucopias of this configuration. Now, what does that mean? What does all this mean? Why 2 cornucopias? Well, first of all, let's look at the combinations. I believe that, having looked at many examples of this type of coin, this design, I believe this to be a poppy pod, not a pomegranate. And you will see where I'm coming from. Because in the middle of the slide is a statue of Livia, the wife of Augustus, holding in one arm a cornucopia stuffed full of fruit. She's wearing flowers in her head. It's good. And in her other hand, also very much to the point, she's holding a bundle of ears of grain and poppy pods on stalks. She was the goddess of agriculture. Livia is represented as Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, the equivalent of Demeter of the Greeks. And we often see when the idea of fecundity, agricultural wealth, is illustrated in Roman and Greek art, that we see ears of grain and poppy pods together, like on the altar of the Augustan peace in Rome, where the idea of the Augustan prosperity is represented by an infant amidst fruit with poppy pods and ears of grain behind. So, in my view, this coin image, this motif, represents fecundity, agricultural fecundity brought about by Hasmonaean peace, that the Hasmoneans brought peace and security to Judea and agricultural wealth. And why 2 cornucopias? Well, remember I mentioned the inscriptions on these coins. They refer to a diarchy of the high priest and the council of the Jews. So these are the 2 roots of authority in Judea, the high priest and the council. And this is allegorized, if you like, by this motif. And it was a very convenient one and a very congenial one for the Hasmonean rulers to adopt as their emblem, as their dynastic emblem. And it therefore was used not only by John Hyrcanus, this emblem, but also by his successors, Judah Aristobulus, Alexander Jannaeus, and Mattathias Antigonus. And we also find it was such a popular motif that it even continued to be copied into the Herodian period. This is part of a decoration of a stone table, where you have this pair of cornucopias and a fruit pod, I think a poppy pod, but very stylized, very artistic between them. But then I wanted to go a stage further and see where the overall design of having the name and titles of the ruling authority on the one side and the emblem of that authority on the other side. Well, we have the coin of John Hyrcanus here. I found that the prototype was a coin, a bronze coin of similar size, a Seleucid coin of Antiochus VI Epiphanes Dionysius. Now, his epithet Dionysius means that he was a follower of Dionysus, and his emblem is appropriately a leopard. And you can see the leopard spots on this image. It's not any feline, has to be a leopard. Sure enough, the leopard is the emblematic animal of Dionysus. We see this combination on a mosaic, on a very early floor mosaic from the 4th century BC in Pella, Macedonia. So what we have is one side, the name and titles of the ruler in a wreath. In this case, it's an olive wreath. In the case of Antiochus VI, it seems to be an ivy wreath, but it's not always that clear. And on the other side, on the obverse, the dynastic or personal emblem of the ruler. So you can see the influences at work. This shows the influence from the Seleucid coin motifs to the Judean coin motifs. The smallest coin is the last one I'm going to look at, and it has on the one side this rose of Rhodes. I think I found the actual prototype in the small silver piece of similar size from Rhodes, and why I think it's the same, the beads around the rose are the same as large beads as you have on the Rhodian coin, and you have a bud below and an ear of grain on the other side. So there's a close similarity. Now, why should a rose of Rhodes be used on a Judean coin? Well, I was not the first person to identify this flower, not as a lily, as many of my predecessors who've looked at this coin have thought it to be, but as a rose of Rhodes. It was Emmanuel Maine, a French scholar, who said, no, this is a rose. But her explanation, which I didn't agree with, was that these coins were issued to pay mercenaries, Greek mercenaries, in the service of the Hasmonaean kings. Yes, they had mercenaries, we're told that in the book 1 of Maccabees, but they're too small and too low value. Wherever mercenaries are paid, they want silver or gold, you can be sure. No, I think I see a different explanation. Rhodes, just as Athens was the major economic power of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 5th century BCE, by the 2nd century BCE, Athens had declined, and the main commercial power of the Eastern Mediterranean was Rhodes. And we know this because of the trade that we can see in archaeological finds. In particular, wine amphorae. Many wine amphorae, which are found either partly preserved, their handles, or more fully preserved, they are stamped with the signature of Rhodes, showing that their origin was Rhodes. They have the rose and they have the name of the magistrate. Many of these jar handles of amphorae stamped with the rose of Rhodes have been found in Jerusalem, hundreds of them, in fact. There are some in the British Museum, even from Jerusalem. There are some in the PEF. This one is actually from the PEF. And so it was a very visible logo that everybody knew. And just like Coca-Cola in our own times. And therefore, if they wanted a flower, maybe they thought they were looking for a lily, but they weren't too particular, so they chose the Rhodes of Rhodes, so that it reflects the economic and political conditions of that period in a beautiful way. Even the Seleucids copied the Rose of Rhodes on their coins. This is a coin of Alexander Ballas. As for the reverse, the other side, the branch. Well, a lot of numismatists thought, oh, it's a Judean coin, it must be a lulav, the palm branch from the ceremony of the tabernacle festival. No, it is not. Because why? This palm branch, it is a palm branch, has a fillet band, has the ribbon attached to its tip. Now, where does that come from? That is specific. That is an emblem of victory. It has a specific meaning in Greek iconography. It's a symbol of victory. And Athena, the goddess, is often shown bearing a palm branch with a fillet attached to it, as well as holding in her other hand a winged victory with a wreath, holding a wreath, just like on the monument to Queen Victoria outside Buckingham Palace, which is based on this image. But closer to home, so to speak, is this coin of Tyre, which shows a very similar filleted palm branch. And Tyre wasn't Jewish. They can't say that this is a Jewish symbol at all. It is a symbol of victory. Now, of course, the Hasmonaeans wanted to advertise their military prowess and success, hence the helmet that we saw and the palm branch. And scholars have even remarked that maybe the wreath, which surrounding the inscription on the middle-sized coin, is also a victory symbol. Anyway, so where does Jewish imagery come into any of this? Where are the Jewish symbols? Well, they do appear, but only right at the end, and I'll explain. But first, let me recap what we have done, what we have covered so far. There were two beginnings of Judean coinage. There was the first run of coins in the last decades of Persian rule, continuing into the mid-3rd century BCE. It was entirely of silver, was completely iconic. All coins had animal or human imagery, including representations of deities, and are only distinguishable from those coins of neighboring states by virtue of the presence of the name Yehud on the coins, and of course the use of Paleo-Hebrew and the Jewish theophoric names like Hezekiah and John, Jechoniah, which contain the letters Yud Hey, which represent the God of Israel. But that's all. And then we have the second phase of the second run of Judean coins, more than a century later. Now it's entirely of bronze. It scrupulously avoids human or animal images, although, again, it does have Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions. They do use Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions, which is now archaic. Paleo-Hebrew alphabet by this time was no longer in common use. Maybe it was used in the temple and in ceremonial, but not any longer as a popular script. But now the titles of the rulers are there, although we did have a governor's name mentioned before, or sometimes they're mentioned as kings. Alexander Jannaeus describes himself as a king on some of these coins. However, although they are iconic, the coin motifs all originated as attributes, as symbols of Greek deities, but they were repurposed and given meanings that bore on the virtuous qualities of the rulers, in this case, Hasmonean rulers. Now, at the very end of the Hasmonean period, this is my last slide, we suddenly encounter Jewish symbols. We're talking about the very end when Mattathias Antigonus, the final Hasmonean king, is under siege in Jerusalem with Herod and the Roman army besieging him. And as a final issue of coinage, he produces this emergency coin, and we know it was made in a hurry. It was produced in a hurry because the dies that are used to stamp the coins, these all struck coins, they're not cast coins, the dies are too big for the flans, for the pieces of metal. So the inscriptions fall off the edges. You see, the dies are meant for bigger coins. But anyhow, what do they show? They show the cult appurtenances of the temple, the two chief cult appurtenances, the menorah, the seven-branch candlestick, and the table of the showbread. These were the two chief appurtenances of the Jerusalem temple. And they were again in the time of the siege of and destruction of the temple by Titus. So on the great frieze under the Arch of Titus, showing the procession with the spoils taken out of the temple, you see the seven-branch candlestick, the menorah, and the table of the showbread. So on that note, I will end my talk and invite you to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this very quite fascinating survey, because you managed to avoid some of the pitfalls of rather provincial interpretations of these Judean coins, which is typical of the older treatment of these coins, always looking for Jewish symbols. And the way you've taken a sort of international approach and very carefully documented the evidence is very impressive. And we have some questions already in the chat, and I'd like to encourage others to put your questions in the chat. But the very first question is, I find a very interesting one, and this is about the scripts. So Michael Hilton asks about how long Old Hebrew script was used, but it's used together with the Aramaic script. And is there any pattern that you can see in the use of Paleo-Hebrew versus Aramaic script on these coins?
Well, it's an interesting, thanks for that question. It's a very interesting one. This has been examined by scholars. It's a question of great interest. It's not that they are all devoid of Aramaic inscriptions. Coins of there are issues of Alexander Jannaeus that are in Aramaic Hebrew, in square Hebrew, and in Aramaic language. But there are few. The majority are in Paleo-Hebrew and in Hebrew, not Aramaic. And the general view, and I accept this, that, well, in the first phase of coinage, it was more or less still quite current, we could say. It wasn't, Aramaic was in the process of it was in the ascendant, but you could argue there were still people who knew Paleo-Hebrew. In the second phase, it was definitely archaic. It was totally beyond, no longer used by the public. And the view is that it was still the answer that's often given is that it was still the script used in the temple and by the temple authorities. Why? Because we also find it used, this Paleo-Hebrew continues to be used through the first vault right to the very end, to the Bar Kokhba event. So it had a certain, in those days, civilizations prided themselves on their antiquity because it sort of provided them with a stamp of authority and of validity. And it's a reason often given why the Jews were tolerated by the Romans in the way that the Christians weren't. The Christians were regarded as part of a new cult, and that was held against. It's often used like that by pagan authors who were arguing against Christianity. I'm bringing this in because it probably is a validity here. I'm not sure that this is the decisive and only answer, but it's the one that you encounter and is in the literature and recent literature, and the one that most people seem to accept.
So just to follow this up, Paleo-Hebrew, although you said it's used in the temple, but are you suggesting that it's more nationalistic than religious in terms of an authoritative script?
Could be. It could be. Yet, you say nationalistic. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find with many of them, the scrolls are written in square Hebrew, the modern Hebrew script, but the name of God is still there in Paleo-Hebrew. So is it just nationalist?
Yes, I don't know. I think this is an open question that we can perhaps come back to. Now, Martin asks, with all these states issuing their own coinage, how do they manage rates of exchange? How do they?
It's a good question. Rates of exchange. Well, this is something I've looked at myself. I've published on it. You saw that initially, well, first of all, when we look at the earlier phase of coinage, the Hein Gittler has tried to try to identify the system of coinage used for the silver coins. And much of it seems to be related to the Athenian standard. So it would therefore be exchangeable. Now, the reason why it was, and this also applies to later coinage, why it's only the lower denominations that were produced, because that's another question. Why are only low denominations produced in Judea, not the large silver pieces and the gold pieces and so on? Well, partly it's because they didn't have much silver. There was no silver produced, but more importantly, they had to have a coinage that was interchangeable, and because they had to depend on imported coins, as it were, from Tyre or from Athens or from wherever, from outside Judea, for large transactions. And only small transactions were done with the local coins. And indeed, the coinage system used by the Hasmoneans was the Seleucid standard, which was actually based on the Athenian standard.
From an economic point, that makes very good sense. Maureen Bloom raises the question that the British Museum put a gold coin from the temple in Jerusalem on display, and then they took it off display. David Hendon says there aren't any ancient gold coins.
No, no.
So this must have been a fake, presumably.
Yeah, there were no gold coins in Judean coinage. They're only silver, and the silver that was produced in the Bar Kokhba, well, we know where the silver came from that was used on the Bar Kokhba coins. It wasn't Judean silver. They took Greek and East Greek, sort of what are called Greek imperial, that is Roman provincial silver coins and Greek and Roman coins, and flattened them, took off the images that were there before, and stamped them with their own types. That's what happened in the Bar Kokhba rebellion. In the first revolt, it is believed that the shekels and half shekels that were minted used the silver from the temple. It was temple.
So Philip Fishman asks about the dinar. When does that come into?
Well, the dinar is a denarius, isn't it? That's what the dinar means. It's denarius. It's a. I don't know. I haven't studied it directly, but it's based. That's the name comes from the Roman standard denomination.
So it was in use all the time.
Yes.
Right. Okay, there was just one other question, and that was about the tetradrachm of Cilicia, huh? The
Yes.
Baal of Tarsus, huh? Right.
Yeah, the bowl, that's the Strata. It's not a, it's a Strata coin. It's a different standard, that one.
Right. So I think we had an answer already given to Simon by David Hendon about the obverse, what are the comparables for the box frame on the reverse? That's what he asks, huh?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
He asks about the box frame on the reverse.
Oh, yes, the box frame. Well, that is a sort of an East Greek form. You see it on Rhodium coins. You see it in a lot of East Greek coins. I mean, Tarsus was a gateway in between the Eastern world, the Near East, and Greece. That's why the hills around outside Tarsus are called the Cilician Gates. It's a gateway between two different cultural and geographical parts of the world.
Well, if I don't see any other messages in the chat, so I'm going to ask final one myself.
Yeah.
And that's this. I'm not surprised at the dearth of coinage in the 3rd century, because it's a period when there's not much documentation at all.
That's right.
From Judea. What we have the Xenon papyri, which more or less tells us that Egypt ruled Judea and mined it for olives and wine and slaves. And we have precious little information from that time.
Yes. No, you're right.
I know the literary people try to assume that this was an important time. I see this over and over again. 3rd century was an important time for the developing of apocryphal texts and other things.
I think it was a period of flux. Remember that around 200 BC, the Levant, the southern Levant, was taken from the Ptolemies by the Seleucids. The time of, we're talking about the period of Antiochus III.
Right.
I mean, that is in a way a dark period, as you say, for Judea, but there was a lot going on, but it was roundabout. And I think, as it were, probably the Judeans just kept their heads below the parapet.
Or nothing much was happening from an economic standpoint, so there wasn't much need for coinage. Huh? But it's interesting to see how the coinage can sometimes reflect other kinds of realities on the ground. Huh?
Yes, that's true. I mean, when the light of history reappears in Judea, it's still a period of turmoil. The Ptolemies are still fighting the Seleucids. You have these big campaigns by Ptolemy VI, right up and down the coast. And he's issuing coins all over the place, even in the Levant.
Well, so you've given us a really fascinating view into this picture that we wouldn't get from any other historical source. So
exactly.
It's extremely valuable. So I just want to say, I don't see any more questions in the. So thank you very much, David, for this fascinating talk. Good night. Bye-bye, everyone.